So there I was, Jake Rodriguez, professional fixer of things that shouldn't break but always do, elbow deep in the guts of Air Recycler Unit 7 Alpha whatever, when I heard it. A sound that definitely wasn't supposed to come from a machine designed to make breathable air out of whatever cosmic nonsense we'd been breathing for the past 6 months. It was crying. Now you might think, Jake, crying sounds are pretty normal on a space station with 12,000 beings from 47 different species. And you'd be right. Except this crying was coming from inside the ventilation system, and last time I checked, the air ducts weren't zoned for residential use. I followed the sound through maintenance shaft C7, muttering every curse word I knew in 5 languages, which, thanks to working on an interstellar trade station, was a lot. The crying got louder as I crawled through the cramped space, my tool belt catching on every rivet and joint designed by engineers who clearly never had to actually fix anything. That's when I found him. Floating about 2 feet off the duct floor was the most adorable alien baby I'd ever seen. And before you ask, yes, I'd seen alien babies before. Harmony Point wasn't exactly a family-friendly vacation spot, but when you're the crossroads of 3 galactic sectors, you get all types. This little guy was different, though. He was a Zephyrian. I could tell by the pale blue skin and the way he was literally floating in mid-air, which was apparently what they did when they were happy. He couldn't have been more than a few months old, wearing what looked like a tiny spacesuit that was definitely not regulation. His big, dark eyes locked onto mine, and he immediately stopped crying, instead making this little gurgling sound that I swear was laughter. "Well, hello there, little fella," I said, because apparently I talk to babies now. "What are you doing in my nice, clean air duct?" The baby, let's call him Pip because he was making these adorable little pip-pip sounds, reached out with tiny hands toward me. Against my better judgment, I scooped him up. He was surprisingly light, which I guess made sense given the whole floating thing. That's when I noticed the problem. Zephyrians don't just abandon their kids. They're incredibly protective of their young, to the point where they'll start interstellar incidents over playground disputes. So either this baby had the worst parents in the galaxy, or something was very, very wrong. I tried calling station security first, got transferred 4 times before being told that unattended alien minors fell under the jurisdiction of the Interspecies Child Services Bureau, which was apparently closed for the next 3 hours due to a cultural sensitivity training seminar. I tried calling medical. They told me that unless the baby was actively dying or leaking fluids, it was a security matter. I tried calling maintenance dispatch to report that I'd found a baby in the air ducts, and my supervisor, Carl, just laughed and said, "Rodriguez, if I had a credit for every time someone found something weird in the vents, I'd own this station. Just, I don't know, put up a lost and found notice or something." So there I was, holding a floating alien baby who seemed perfectly content to grab my nose and make happy noises, while every official on the station passed the buck like it was a game of hot potato. "Looks like it's just you and me, Pip," I said, as the little guy discovered my tool belt and started trying to eat a sonic screwdriver. "At least until someone who actually gets paid to deal with this stuff shows up." Famous last words right there. 2 hours later, I was still carrying Pip around like the world's most unusual tool bag when all hell broke loose in the diplomatic sector. And by all hell, I mean the kind of chaos that happens when someone accuses someone else of kidnapping in front of a room full of heavily armed aliens who already don't trust each other. Ambassador Victoria Sterling, you know, the one with the permanent stick up her rear end and the ability to make paperwork sound like a personal insult, was in the middle of what the news feeds were calling crucial peace negotiations with the Zephyrians. These talks had been going on for 3 months, and from what I'd heard through the maintenance worker gossip network, they were about as successful as a chocolate teapot. The Zephyrin delegation was led by War Commander Thrax, who looked exactly like what you'd expect from someone with war in their job title. 8 feet tall, muscles that had muscles, and the kind of scowl that suggested he'd rather be conquering planets than sitting in a conference room arguing about trade agreements. So naturally, this was the perfect moment for me to walk into the diplomatic wing, covered in space dust and holding a giggling Zephyrian baby. "Excuse me," I said, approaching the nearest official-looking person, which happened to be Ambassador Sterling's assistant, Marcus. "I found this little guy in the air ducts, and I was wondering if—" Marcus took one look at me, then at Pip, then back at me, and his face went through about 7 different shades of panic. "Security!" he screamed, loud enough to wake the dead. "Security! The human has taken a Zephyrian child." Now, I want you to understand something about Zephyrians. They're not just protective of their kids. They're psychotically protective. Like, will literally declare war over a skinned knee protective. So when War Commander Thrax heard Marcus's announcement, he didn't stop to ask questions. He just stood up, all 8 feet of him, and pointed at me with what I can only describe as the finger of doom. "You dare steal a child of the Zephian Empire?" he roared, his voice echoing through the corridor. "This is an act of war!" "Whoa, whoa, whoa," I said, holding up my free hand while Pip continued to float happily in my other arm, completely oblivious to the fact that his presence was about to start an interstellar incident. "I didn't steal anybody. I found him in the air ducts. He was crying." Ambassador Sterling appeared at that moment, looking like she'd aged about 10 years in the last 10 seconds. "Mr. Rodriguez," she said, her voice tight with barely controlled panic, "please tell me you did not just kidnap a Zephyrian infant." "I didn't kidnap anybody," I protested. "I found him. In the ventilation system, he was alone." War Commander Thrax's scowl deepened, which I honestly didn't think was physically possible. "Zephian young are never alone. Someone placed him there, and you retrieved him. This is theft of the highest order." "Or," I said, trying to inject some logic into what was rapidly becoming the stupidest conversation of my life, "someone left him there and I rescued him. Did anyone think to check if this little guy's parents are actually looking for him?" The silence that followed was the kind of silence you get when you ask a room full of diplomats to use common sense. It was awkward, lengthy, and somehow made everything worse. Finally, Ambassador Sterling cleared her throat. "Mr. Rodriguez, regardless of your intentions, you are now in possession of a Zephyrian child during sensitive negotiations. This is a security matter." "It's a child care matter," I shot back. "This baby needs food, attention, and probably a diaper change. He doesn't need to be a political football." War Commander Thrax stepped forward, his massive frame casting a shadow over me and Pip. "Return the child immediately or face the consequences." I looked down at Pip, who was now trying to eat my name tag and making those adorable pip-pip sounds. Then I looked back at the assembled diplomats, security guards, and one very angry alien war commander. "You know what?" I said. "Fine. But first, I have one question. If this baby is so important, and if Zephyrs never abandon their young, then where exactly are his parents?" Another silence. This one was even more awkward than the first. His parents are..." War Commander Thrax started, then stopped. He looked confused, which was apparently not an expression he was used to wearing. "That's what I thought," I said. "So until someone can answer that question, I'm not handing him over to anybody." And that's how I became public enemy number 1 to 2 different species before lunch. You know what's funny about being hunted by both human security and angry alien warriors? It really puts your knowledge of maintenance tunnels to the test. I'd been crawling through service corridors for the better part of an hour, with Pip floating along beside me like the galaxy's most adorable accomplice, when I ran into Dr. Elena Vasquez. Elena was a xenobiologist, which meant she was one of the few people on the station who actually understood alien biology, instead of just shooting at it or trying to tax it. She was also the only person who didn't immediately try to arrest me when she saw me emerge from a maintenance hatch carrying a Zephyrian baby. "Jake Rodriguez," she said, raising an eyebrow. "I heard you started a war." "I didn't start anything," I protested, settling Pip on my lap as we sat in her cramped laboratory. "I found a baby. Apparently that's a crime now." And Elena leaned forward, studying Pip with scientific interest. "This is interesting. Zephyrian infants this young shouldn't be able to maintain sustained flight. The fact that he's floating consistently suggests he's either unusually developed or under significant stress." "Stress?" I looked down at Pip, who was currently trying to grab Elena's scanner with both hands. "He seems pretty happy to me." "Happiness and stress aren't mutually exclusive in Zephyrian psychology," Elena explained. "The floating could be a defense mechanism, and you're right about one thing. Where are his parents?" Finally, someone who was asking the right questions. Elena ran a few scans while Pip giggled and tried to eat her equipment. "According to his biosignatures, he's approximately 4 months old. And Jake, this is important, he's not just any Zephyrian baby. The genetic markers indicate he's from House Kethvar, one of the major noble families." "Great," I muttered. "I accidentally kidnapped alien royalty. This day just keeps getting better." "That's not the weird part," Elena continued, frowning at her readings. "I've been monitoring the diplomatic channels. House Kethvar isn't even supposed to be on this station. According to the official records, they're back on Zephyria Prime, attending some kind of ceremonial function." I felt a chill run down my spine. So either the official records were wrong, or someone wanted this baby to disappear, Elena finished. Jake, I've been tracking some unusual activity over the past few weeks. Ships arriving with no cargo manifests, encrypted communications that don't match any known diplomatic protocols, and financial transfers that don't make sense for a trade negotiation. You think someone's been planning this? Elena pulled up a holographic display showing the station's recent activity. Look at this. 3 days ago, a ship registered to the Nexus Collective docked at Bay 74. They claimed to be delivering medical supplies, but the manifest was sealed under commercial privilege. I'd heard of the Nexus Collective. They were one of those shadowy organizations that seem to have their fingers in every major conflict in the galaxy. They sold weapons to both sides, provided consulting services to governments, and generally made a profit wherever people were shooting at each other. You think they're involved in this? I think, Elena said carefully, that a missing heir to a major Zephyrian house, discovered during crucial peace negotiations, is exactly the kind of incident that would guarantee those negotiations fail. Pip chose that moment to let out a happy squeal and float up to eye level, as if he was trying to join our conversation. I caught him gently and pulled him back down. So what you're saying is, this little guy wasn't abandoned, he was planted. It's possible, and if that's true, then handing him over to either side plays right into their hands. The Zephyrians will blame humans for the kidnapping, humans will blame Zephyrians for the false accusation, and everyone goes home angry and ready for war. While the Nexus Collective sells weapons to both sides, I added. Exactly. I looked down at Pip, who was now trying to grab my nose again. So what do we do? Elena was quiet for a moment, staring at her data. We need proof, real evidence that this was orchestrated, and we need to find out what happened to his real parents. And until then? Until then, you keep doing what you're doing. Don't let anyone take him. That's when the alarms started blaring. Attention all station personnel, came the announcement over the comm system. This is War Commander Thrax of the Zephian Empire. The human Jake Rodriguez has committed an act of war against our people. He has 1 hour to surrender the stolen child, or we will consider this station and all its inhabitants enemy combatants. I looked at Elena. 1 hour? Hall an hour, she confirmed. Pip made a happy gurgling sound and floated a little higher, apparently thinking the flashing lights were some kind of game. Well, I said, standing up and tucking Pip back into my arms. I guess we'd better work fast. Because if there's one thing I've learned from years of fixing broken things, it's that the more complicated something looks, the simpler the solution usually is. And right now, the simplest solution was to prove that everyone was being played by people who profit from chaos. Too bad we only had 59 minutes to do it. 57 minutes later, I learned that Zephyrian ultimatums are more like guidelines than actual deadlines. The first explosion rocked the station 3 minutes early, which really should have been my first clue that this whole situation was about to go sideways in spectacular fashion. I was back in the maintenance tunnels, my new home away from home, with Pip floating beside me like a tiny, blue-skinned beacon of hope in a galaxy gone mad. Elena had gone to gather more evidence about the Nexus Collective's involvement, while I played the role of guy keeping the baby alive, while everyone else tries to kill each other. The second explosion was closer, and I could hear the distinctive whine of Zephyrian plasma cannons charging up. Through the maintenance grates, I caught glimpses of blue-armored warriors moving through the corridors, their weapons trained on everything that moved. Attention station personnel, came Ambassador Sterling's voice over the comm system, barely audible over the sound of emergency klaxons. This is a code red evacuation. All civilians report to emergency shelters immediately. This is not a drill. Pip looked up at me with those big dark eyes and made a questioning sound, like he was asking why all the adults were suddenly acting crazy. That's a very good question, little guy, I said, scooping him up as another explosion shook the station. Unfortunately, the answer is, because grown-ups are idiots. I made my way through the service tunnels toward the central hub, where the main communication array was located. If Elena was right about the Nexus Collective's involvement, we needed to get that information to both sides before they blew each other, and us, to pieces. The tunnels were hot, cramped, and filled with the kind of smoke that suggested important things were on fire. Pip seemed to sense the danger, staying close to me instead of floating around like usual. Every few minutes, he'd reach out and grab my shirt, as if making sure I was still there. Don't worry, buddy, I told him, navigating around a section of tunnel that was glowing red-hot from weapon fire above. I've got you. We're going to get through this. Famous last words again. I was crawling through a particularly narrow section when I heard voices in the corridor above. Human voices, which should have been reassuring, except they were talking about me. Rodriguez has to be somewhere in this section, came the voice of Captain Morrison, head of station security. The alien commander wants him found and delivered within the hour, or they're going to start targeting civilian areas. Sir, replied another voice I didn't recognize, shouldn't we be focusing on evacuation protocols? The Zephyrines have already breached levels 7 through 12. The evacuation is secondary to ending this conflict, Morrison snapped. Find Rodriguez, take the baby, and maybe we can salvage this situation. I held Pip a little tighter. Even my own people were treating him like a bargaining chip instead of a living being who needed protection. The corridor above fell silent as the security team moved on, but I could hear the sound of boots and weapons echoing throughout the station. I was running out of places to hide, and more importantly, I was running out of time. That's when I heard Elena's voice through my comm unit, barely audible over the static. Jake, can you hear me? I've got the evidence, but the communication array is down. The Nexus Collective ship is still docked at Bay 74, and I've detected life signs that match Zephyrian biosignatures. I think they have his parents. I keyed my comm. Elena, where are you? Level 15, near the docking bays. Jake, there's something else. I intercepted a transmission from the Nexus ship. They're not just trying to start a war. They're planning to eliminate both negotiation teams once the fighting starts. This whole thing is designed to decapitate the leadership of both sides. The implications hit me like a plasma bolt to the chest. This wasn't just about starting a war. It was about making sure the war would be long, bloody, and profitable for everyone except the people actually fighting it. Another explosion, this one close enough to shake dust from the tunnel ceiling. Pip whimpered and grabbed onto my shirt with both hands. It's okay, little guy, I said, but I could hear the fear in my own voice. We're going to fix this. I made a decision that probably qualified as the stupidest thing I'd ever done, which was saying something given my track record. Instead of heading for the emergency shelters like a sane person, I turned toward the central communication hub. The journey took 15 minutes that felt like 15 hours. I could hear the battle raging above me, plasma fire, projectile weapons, and the distinctive sound of Zepharian war cries mixing with human combat orders. The station was tearing itself apart, and I was crawling through its guts with a baby who trusted me to keep him safe. When I finally reached the communication hub, I found it in chaos. Half the equipment was damaged, sparks were flying from broken conduits, and the air was thick with smoke. But the emergency broadcast system was still functional. I set Pip down in a corner where he'd be safe from the sparks, and started working on the communication array. My hands were shaking, from fear, adrenaline, or both, but I managed to patch into the station-wide emergency channel. This is Jake Rodriguez, I said into the microphone, my voice echoing through the station's speakers. I'm broadcasting on all frequencies to both human and Zephyrian forces. You need to stop shooting at each other and listen to what I have to say. The response was immediate and predictable. More explosions, more weapons fire, and Captain Morrison's voice screaming through the comm system about unauthorized broadcasts. But I kept talking. The baby I found. His name is Pip, and he's not a kidnap victim. He's a plant. Someone wanted him to be found during the peace negotiations, and they wanted both sides to blame each other. The Nexus Collective has been orchestrating this whole thing, and they've got his real parents imprisoned on their ship in Docking Bay 74. I could hear the weapons fire slowing down just a little. Maybe they were listening. I've got proof, I continued, patching Elena's data into the broadcast. Financial records, communication intercepts, and bioscan data that shows Zephyrian life signs on the Nexus ship. This whole thing is a setup designed to start a war that will make them rich while the rest of us die. The station fell silent for a moment. Then War Commander Thrax's voice boomed through the speakers. Human Jake Rodriguez, if what you say is true, you will have our eternal gratitude. If you lie, you will have our eternal wrath. I'm not lying, I said, looking down at Pip, who was floating up toward me with his arms outstretched. And I've got a baby here who just wants his parents back. That's when the real shooting started. You know what's worse than being in the middle of a space battle? Being in the middle of a space battle that suddenly changes direction. Because when War Commander Thrax announced that both human and Zephyrian forces were going to jointly assault Docking Bay 74, the Nexus Collective decided to stop playing subtle and start playing blow up everything in sight. I was still in the communication hub with Pip when the first Nexus plasma cannon opened fire on the station's main reactor. The explosion was so powerful it threw me against the wall, and I barely managed to catch Pip before he floated into a shower of sparks from the damaged equipment. Jake, Elena's voice crackled through the comm system. The Nexus ship is powering up weapons. They're going to try to destroy the evidence. What evidence? I shouted back. holding Pip close as another explosion rocked the station. "We already broadcast everything." "Not everything," Elena replied. "If they destroy their ship with the prisoners aboard, they can claim the whole thing was a false flag operation. They'll say we manufactured the evidence to cover up your kidnapping of the baby." Of course, because nothing in this galaxy could ever be simple. Through the damaged viewports I could see the Nexus Collective ship, a sleek, black vessel that looked like it was designed by someone who thought ominous was a good design philosophy. It was pulling away from the docking bay, its weapons systems charging up for what was obviously going to be a scorched earth departure. "Elena," I said into the comm, "please tell me you have a plan." "I'm working on it," she replied. "But Jake, you need to get out of there. The communication hub is going to be their primary target. They can't let you keep broadcasting." As if summoned by her words, the first Nexus plasma bolt slammed into the communication array, turning half the equipment into molten slag. The emergency broadcast system went dead, and the lights flickered ominously. Pip looked up at me with those big, trusting eyes and made a questioning sound. "I know, buddy," I said, tucking him securely in my arms. "This is definitely not going according to plan." That's when I heard footsteps in the corridor outside. Heavy, armored footsteps that definitely weren't human or Zephyrian. "Mr. Rodriguez," came a voice that sounded like it was being processed through a dozen different modulators. "You have caused us considerable inconvenience." 3 figures in black armor entered the communication hub, their weapons trained on me. Nexus Collective operatives, probably here to tie up loose ends. Their leader, distinguishable only by slightly fancier armor, stepped forward. "You will surrender the Zephyrian infant and accompany us to our ship," the leader said. "Your interference in our operation ends now." "Let me guess," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "You're going to blame his disappearance on the battle. Maybe say he was killed in the crossfire." "The infant was never supposed to survive the operation," the leader replied with the kind of casual cruelty that made my blood boil. "His purpose was to provide justification for conflict. Now that purpose has been served." Pip made a soft sound and grabbed my shirt tighter, as if he could sense the danger. "You know what your problem is?" I said, backing toward the emergency maintenance hatch. "You think like accountants. Everything's just numbers on a spreadsheet to you, but this isn't a number." I held up Pip, who chose that moment to float up a little and wave at the armed operatives with his tiny hand. "This is a baby, a living being with parents who love him, and a future that doesn't involve being a casualty in your profit margins." The leader raised his weapon. "Philosophical discussions are irrelevant. Surrender the infant." That's when War Commander Thrax came through the wall. I don't mean he came through the door. I mean he literally came through the wall, using what I can only assume was a portable plasma cutter to create his own entrance. 8 feet of angry Zephyrian warrior covered in battle armor and carrying enough weapons to level a small city. "You will release the human and the child," he growled, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made smart people reconsider their life choices. The Nexus operative spun around, suddenly facing a very different tactical situation. Behind Thrax I could see more Zephyrian warriors, along with human security forces. Apparently, my broadcast had been more effective than I'd thought. "War Commander," the Nexus leader said, his modulated voice remaining calm, "this is a misunderstanding. We are simply attempting to recover stolen property." "The only theft here," Thrax replied, "is your theft of Zephyr children and the honor of both our peoples." That's when Elena's voice came through the emergency comm system, which she'd apparently managed to repair. "Jake, I've got visual confirmation. The Nexus ship has 2 adult Zephyrians in their detention bay. Biosignatures match the genetic markers for Pip's parents." The effect on War Commander Thrax was immediate and terrifying. His already intimidating presence somehow doubled, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop by several degrees. "You have taken hostages," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You have stolen a child. You have dishonored both our peoples for profit." The Nexus operatives were good, I'll give them that. But they weren't angry Zephyrin War Commander who just found out you kidnapped a baby good. The fight was over in about 30 seconds, and most of that was just cleanup. While the security forces were restraining the Nexus operatives, I found myself face to face with War Commander Thrax. Up close, he was even more intimidating, but there was something different in his eyes now. Relief, maybe, or gratitude. "Human Jake Rodriguez," he said formally, "you have protected a child of the Zephyrian Empire at great personal risk. This will not be forgotten." "I just did what anyone would do," I replied, though we both knew that wasn't entirely true. Thrax looked down at Pip, who was floating between us, apparently fascinated by the War Commander's elaborate armor. "The child recognizes you," Thrax observed. He has bonded with you during this ordeal. He's a good kid, I said, gently guiding Pip back down to my arms. He deserves to be with his real parents. Indeed, Thrax agreed. And thanks to your courage, he will be. Elena's voice crackled through the comm again. Jake, the Joint Task Force has secured the Nexus ship. They're bringing the prisoners back now. I looked down at Pip, who was making his happy pip-pip sounds and trying to grab my nose again. You hear that, little guy? I said. Your mom and dad are coming home. For the first time in hours, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, everything was going to be okay. 3 days later, I was back in the communication hub, supposedly fixing the equipment that had been turned into expensive scrap metal during the battle. In reality, I was procrastinating, because I knew that once everything was repaired, life would go back to normal. And after the past week, normal seemed almost disappointing. The station was buzzing with activity. Repair crews were working around the clock to fix the damage. Journalists were interviewing anyone who'd stand still long enough, and diplomats from both species were falling over themselves to sign new peace accords. Apparently, nothing brings people together like discovering they've both been manipulated by arms dealers. I was elbow deep in a fusion relay when I heard familiar voices in the corridor outside. Jake, Elena called out, you have visitors. I turned around to see War Commander Thrax approaching, but he wasn't alone. Behind him were 2 adult Sefarians who looked like they'd been through hell, but were trying very hard to appear dignified. The female was holding a bundle of blue fabric that was making soft, happy sounds. Mr. Rodriguez, Thrax said formally, I would like you to meet Lord Vexkai and Lady Zilnara of House Kethvar. The parents, Pip's real parents. Lord Vexay stepped forward, and I could see the family resemblance immediately. Same dark eyes, same pale blue skin, same way of tilting his head when he was thinking. But where Pip was all innocent curiosity, his father carried himself with the kind of quiet authority that came from generations of noble breeding. Human Jake Rodriguez, he said, his voice carrying the formal cadence of Zephyrian nobility. You have protected our son when we could not. We are in your debt. You don't owe me anything, I replied, wiping grease off my hands. I just did what needed doing. Lady Zilnara stepped closer, and I could see that she'd been crying. The Nexus Collective told us our son was dead, she said softly. They showed us recordings of his supposed death, used our grief to force us to cooperate with their plan. When we learned he was alive, when we heard he had been cared for by a human who risked everything to protect him. She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Ma'am, I said gently, he's a good kid. He made it easy to care about him. That's when the bundle in her arms started making those familiar pip-pip sounds, and a tiny blue hand reached out from the fabric. Someone wants to see you, Lady Zilnara said with a smile. She handed me the bundle, and there he was, Pip, looking exactly the same as when I'd found him, but somehow different too. More settled, maybe, more at peace. He looked up at me with those big dark eyes and immediately started floating, reaching for my nose with both hands. Hey there, little guy, I said, letting him grab my finger. I see you're back with your folks. Pip made a series of soft sounds that almost sounded like he was trying to tell me about his adventure. The physicians tell us he has formed an unusual attachment to you, Lord Vexai said. In our culture, such bonds are considered sacred. He's been through a lot, I replied, gently bouncing Pip in my arms. He just needed someone to be there for him. Indeed, War Commander Thrax interjected. Which brings us to why we are here. He gestured to the assembled group, and I noticed that Ambassador Sterling had joined us, along with Elena and several other station officials I didn't recognize. Mr. Rodriguez, Thrax continued, your actions have prevented a war between our peoples. You have rescued a child and exposed a conspiracy that threatened the stability of 3 star systems. Both the Zephyrian Empire and the Human Federation owe you a considerable debt. I'm just a maintenance worker, I protested. I fix things that are broken. Yes, said Ambassador Sterling, stepping forward with a smile I'd never seen before. You do, and sometimes the things that are broken are bigger than fusion relays and air recyclers. Elena moved to stand beside me, holding a datapad. Jake, they're offering you a position as a cultural liaison between the 2 species, full diplomatic credentials, significant pay increase, and the opportunity to travel between worlds. I looked down at Pip, who was now trying to eat my name tag again. That sounds like a big responsibility. It is, Lord Vexai agreed. But there is more. In Zephyrian culture, when someone saves a child's life, They become part of that child's family. We would be honored if you would accept the position of Pip's Catherine. Is what now? Cathran, Lady Zilnara explained. The closest translation in your language would be guardian uncle or chosen family member. It is a sacred bond that transcends species boundaries. I looked around at the assembled group. Elena was grinning. Ambassador Sterling was nodding approvingly. War Commander Thrax looked like he was trying not to smile, and Pip's parents were watching me with hopeful expressions. So let me get this straight, I said slowly. You want me to be a diplomat, travel between worlds, and help raise an alien baby who floats when he's happy? That is correct, Thrax confirmed. I looked down at Pip, who chose that moment to float up and grab my nose with both hands, making those adorable pip-pip sounds. Well, I said, I guess my resume could use some updating. 6 months later, I was in the middle of what the news feeds were calling the most successful interspecies cultural exchange program in galactic history. I had a fancy title, a nice office, and the kind of job that actually made a difference in people's lives. But mostly, I had Pip. He was sitting on my desk as I finished my daily maintenance report, because some habits die hard, floating about 6 inches above the surface and trying to help by grabbing my stylus every few minutes. Pip, I said, gently extracting the stylus from his tiny hands. You're supposed to be learning about human culture, not disrupting it. He responded by floating higher and making those happy pip-pip sounds that had become the soundtrack to my new life. You know what, little guy, I said, setting down the stylus and scooping him up. I think you've got the right idea. Some things are more important than paperwork. Through my office window, I could see the construction of the new joint research facility, where human and Zephyrian scientists would work together on projects that would benefit both species. Ships from both civilizations docked peacefully at the station, their crews mingling in the common areas without a hint of the suspicion that had once defined their relationship. All because someone had left a baby in an air duct and a maintenance worker had refused to let go. Pip floated up to eye level and reached out to touch my face with his tiny hand, as if he was checking to make sure I was still there. I'm not going anywhere, buddy, I told him. We're family now. And for the first time in my life, I meant it, in the best possible way. Because sometimes, the most important things in the universe aren't the big dramatic gestures or the grand political movements. Sometimes, they're as simple as refusing to abandon someone who needs you, even when everyone else thinks you're crazy. Especially when everyone else thinks you're crazy. After all, that's what family does.